My name is Allison Felis, and this is I'll Follow You, a podcast featuring light and lively conversations about film, music, and creative culture, coming to you from the People's Republic of Rogers Park on the far northeast side of Chicago. Welcome back to I'll Follow You. Today, I'm in conversation with the brilliant poet and editor Francesca Kritikos. Francesca is the author of the chapbooks It Felt Like Worship, published by Sad Spell Press in 2017, and Animals Don't Go to Hell, published by Bottlecap Press in 2021, as well as the forthcoming full-length collection Exercise in Desire, which will be published by Vegetarian Alcoholic Press in early 2022. Her poetry has also appeared in the Despair Quarterly, Ghost City Review, and Witchcraft Mag. She completed the undergraduate creative writing program at the University of East Anglia in the UK in 2017. On a recent cool and rainy October morning, we got to go deep on resisting the compulsive productivity of capitalism by writing in bed, how when you're a girl, you can get away with saying less, how the linguistic conventions of medical editing have informed the evolution of her style as a poet, and making sure poetry is accessible to everyone, especially outside of an academic context. And now, my conversation with Francesca Kritikos. So hello, Francesca. Thank you for being with me today.
Thank you so much for having me.
So before we get started into sort of talking process and everything else, I just would love for you to sort of introduce yourself and sort of tell people who you are and what you do and what you've got published and what you've got going on, and just a little capsule overview of what you're all about.
Yeah, of course. So I was born and raised in Chicago, but I guess I consider myself like a Greek American poet, having grown up within like the Greek American community and Greek Orthodox community. And that's something that I feel like definitely has had an impact on my life. I've gone to Chicago public schools my whole life, so I'm a big proponent of that. I think that's also just had a huge impact on who I am and my writing. And I actually ended up going to university at the University of East Anglia in England. It's in Norwich on the East Coast, and I studied creative writing there, which was a really great opportunity, and I'm really lucky that I was able to go there on scholarship and being able to finish, my bachelor's degree in 3 years. I think that had a huge impact on my life, and I felt like I'm not a big academia person, so I kind of was glad that I could have that kind of non-traditional experience and also graduate sooner and start my life, I guess. And that's where I really started focusing in on poetry and thinking this is something that I want to do for the rest of my life. So the year that I graduated in 2017, my first chapbook came out through Witchcraft Mag's publishing arm, which is called Sad Spell Press. So they published my first chapbook, It Felt Like Worship, in June 2017. Then I moved back to Chicago. I started working as an editor at a medical healthcare related business intelligence company, and started learning more about journalism and editing, and continued to write poetry, but that also definitely made my style shift into a more economic and sparse style of writing, I guess, than what my voice had been during university. And I kept writing, and then just this summer, my second chapbook, Animals Don't Go to Hell, came out with Bottlecap Press through their Bottlecap Features imprint. And I also have a full-length collection coming out early next year with Vegetarian Alcoholic Press, called Exercise in Desire. So it's been a really exciting time. I feel like for 2018, 2019, I was pretty dormant with my writing, and just in a processing stage. And now I feel like I have I don't know, things coming out and projects that I'm working on. So that's been really exciting.
Yeah, I mean, you do strike me as like incredibly prolific. I mean, like as I follow you on social media, and it just seems like you like are pretty amazing with like how much work you've got coming out. I mean, so is that something you really have like strived to do, to be like, yeah, I gotta like get more work out there, or is it just happening naturally, or what's that process like for you?
I think it's been a natural process. I was kind of having a little bit of like an identity crisis, like having started a full-time job in 2017, again, writing and editing a lot from like a medical perspective and not really thinking about my own writing as much. And like, that was just like a huge life change. And working, like overtime and living under capitalism and worrying about like rent and like bills and everything and paying off student loans. And so like, I guess my attention was on that for a while. And I was still writing, but I think I kind of lost the sense of like working on a project for like a couple of years there. And I remember thinking to myself one day, maybe in like 2019, I was like, am I still a poet? Like I had this kind of like loss of self. And then I was like, I need to, like refocus my life and like my priorities, because I felt like I had like no personality almost. And that was tough. So I started making more time for like writing and compiling my poems, even if it was just like a couple of lines that I happened to think of and jot down into like different Google Docs, kind of like based on theme. And then naturally from that, it was kind of like a good way of like encouraging myself to continue building onto those different projects. And I joined different poetry workshops to try to like force myself to create time for this. I tried to set up better boundaries with like work-life balance. And then naturally, I just felt like that helped me write more and become more prolific. And then finally around like maybe like last year, I started feeling more comfortable to like start sending out my work to publishers and like submitting to magazines. And so it was kind of like a few years coming, but that has just maybe started to pay off more this year, because I feel like now I'm kind of seeing the results of like that kind of like crisis and like years of like working on that.
No, that's really interesting. Yeah. I mean, do you feel like that's sort of like another origin story in a way? I mean, you sort of talked about, when you went to university and you were like, yeah, like poetry is the thing that I want to do. Like, is this sort of like the second phase of that, like recommitting to the poetry, or was it more just kind of like, this sucks. Like, I hate not being able to do the thing that I've sort of identified myself as.
Yeah, I think it was kind of like a rebirth / like reinvention, just because I was realizing that I had gone such a different path from the people that I went to university with, like a lot of them being from England and from the UK and from Europe. Like there's less of like a capitalist pressure there than there is here, I would say. So a lot of them felt totally comfortable to go on to, stay in academia and do like master's degrees and PhDs and work on like cultivating this like artist's life, almost this like writer's life that I really idealized, but I felt like wasn't possible and wasn't a reality in the United States. And to a certain extent, that's true, but I feel like I was seeing how different my life was from their lives. And I was like, it doesn't have to be like this way. Like, I don't have to like, negate myself. And it's not that I like necessarily wanted to go and get a PhD either and like teach at a university. Like, I don't see myself doing that, but I just felt like I also didn't have to like erase that part of myself. And I think that's an important realization to have, that like you can still work towards having a life that you want to live, even if it seems like it's not possible all the time here.
That's super interesting to specifically point out sort of that professionalization of like studying poetry, how then that becomes like its own sort of, you teach, or it's this academic, part of sort of being a quote unquote professional poet. Whereas, yeah, no, you can just no little kid, who's like writing a poem, for their class or something is thinking like, yeah, I mean, I don't know, maybe there are some little kids who think that they want to like, be a poetry professional when they grow up. But I sort of feel like it's interesting that there's that bifurcation between sort of the poetic impulse as it first arises and then sort of what that sometimes gets like churned into. Yeah. And so I love that you were able to sort of resist that and say like, no, I can be a person in the world and I don't have to be on this track that other people are on. Cause it's like, yeah, I totally get like that. I'm kind of like, well, why can't I be a professional musician or a professional writer or whatever, and like these thoughts in the back of my mind that are like, well, am I any less of an artist because I have this day job? And that's a lot of what I love talking to creative people on this podcast about is that sort of tension between like, yeah, be creative in your life. It doesn't have to be something that you do, for your main thing.
Yeah. And I also, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Thanks. Yeah, I was just gonna say, like, I also find that being like a normal, quote unquote, like person in the world and like having like a day job or like when your life can't be your art, it forces you to look at art in a different way. And that's probably different for everyone, but for me, it makes me really want my poetry to be like accessible and understandable to like everyone. Like, I'm not surrounded by poets. I really don't in my day-to-day life like have that many friends who are writers and like don't really have that like community in real life. And I think that that's beneficial almost because I want to make sure that like, I don't know, like that my family and my friends and like, they can understand what I'm trying to say. Like, that's important to me. I feel like sometimes reading poetry that's kind of within like a certain bubble of like poetry people, like I don't understand what it's trying to say. And like I went to school for poetry and I think that's a big problem. Like I want people to be able to get something out of it. I think like kind of like growing up with like a working class background and not really thinking like poetry is something I'll be able to do or like being an artist is something I won't be able to do, but I want people who aren't in that part of society to be able to read my writing and get something out of it. And I think that kind of informs a lot of my poetics and my style.
No, I love that. Not wanting to be so rarefied that like your family doesn't understand like what you're doing. Like I remember being an undergraduate and like when I graduated from college and my dad coming, and my dad was a smart guy. I mean, he's a musician and it was whatever, but like he just felt really dumb like at the graduation ceremony because I went to Indiana University, so like the big main graduation, it was like enormous and it was like in the football stadium. But then the English department, we had our own small little graduation, and they somehow like no one wanted to give a speech, and so I somehow got like wheedled into like giving the talk. And then there was like a professor who like gave a little speech too, and my dad like afterwards he was like, oh, I just didn't understand any of the references or whatever. And I was like, this sucks. Like I don't want to like be perpetuating this thing that's like alienating me from my own family and specifically my own very creative musical parent who was a hugely formative influence on me. So yeah, like I love to hear you say that yeah, like poetry is for the people, man.
Yeah, definitely.
And how like is there, I mean, going back to the family thing, because you very strongly profess, your Greek Americanness, like how does that play into just the way that you understand language and I mean, there's lots of history sort of Greek poetry. I mean, is that something that you like sort of carry with you in your brain and that you think about, or is that not as big a concern, or is it so baked in that it feels natural to you?
Yeah, I think part of it just, like feels natural in a way, like my upbringing being like socialized as a girl and like a big like Greek family, I guess. Like I feel like in a way I was allowed to like fly under the radar because maybe my parents are paying more attention to what my brothers are doing, or there's just like always people around and you're in this like big community, and it allows you to like not be the center of attention because the attention is on something bigger than yourself. And especially, yeah, when you're like a girl, I think you can get away with saying less maybe. And I think that allowed me to have more time to think about what I wanted to say and to sit on my feelings, because I didn't maybe feel comfortable. Like I didn't feel like I could be honest about my feelings just growing up in kind of like a religious setting like that, I guess. And I think that ultimately that was like beneficial, because I've found that like I need to be able to sit on things for a long time before I feel like I'm saying things in the way that I want them to be said. I think that kind of lends itself to like the sparse style that you might see in my writing. And I think like that's definitely a product of like, yeah, that kind of like cultural setting. And also definitely I'm informed by like the Greek poets. Like Sappho is one of my favorite poets and like a huge influence on my writing. And the way that her writing is so simple and so direct and always addressed to like you, like this like other person that she's speaking to, and like using this second person to like, I don't know, react off of them to understand yourself is something that I definitely use as a device in my writing and like rely upon a lot to like be able to describe my own feelings in my poetry.
That's amazing. Like how, I don't know, I'm just really struck by, yeah, you know, poets, you know, talk about Sappho, but to like, yeah, be Greek American and to have that literally like in your lineage. I mean, like, what a gift. That's amazing.
Thanks. Yeah. I think another aspect of it too is having like, I'm not like fluent in Greek, but having grown up speaking and writing Greek and going to like Greek school, I feel like I have this sort of like ecosystem of the second language beneath like English, which is the language I'm most comfortable using. But then at the same time, I'll think twice about like a word choice, because I'm sometimes like translating things in my head and thinking about like the different ways that I could say something, and somehow like, I don't know, that will affect the way that I want to write things, because I'll want to make sure that I'm using the most precise word. And sometimes I'll think of a word that's like in Greek first and then want to like translate it into English. So one of my dreams actually one day is to be able to write like a half Greek, like half English poetry book, or like just have my work translated into Greek. Like I would love that, because the act of translation is so interesting. It's impossible to say the same thing in two different languages, really. And even if you don't want to translate something, I think it's a cool exercise to translate it into a different language and then translate it back and see how the structure of the sentence or phrase or word like might change. So that's something I want to pay attention more in the future.
That's awesome. That's so cool. Yeah. Cause I remember being younger and being like really stressed about like stressed out about reading stuff in translation. Cause I always sort of felt, I mean, and I'm kind of over it now, because I'm like, well, of course, like translators are extremely erudite and extremely careful about like the way that they translate things. But I was always kind of like, well, I'm not getting the language as it was written. So, you know, it's like, I can't fully appreciate it. And I would get like really stressed out about like not wanting to read things in translation, which was really stupid. And I was missing out on a lot of amazing work. But that's cool to have the two languages, like you said, to even just play with that in your brain, even if you are just writing in English. Like I can imagine that just opens up so many possibilities for you, like as a poet, like with working with words, I mean, as your medium.
Yeah, and I love seeing like different translations of the same work by like another writer, like different translations of Sappho are so different, and it really opens your mind to all the possibilities of language. And like I feel like a big thing that writers say is like language is not enough because there's no perfect way to like say anything, but at the same time I feel like it's like too much. Like I think I'm someone who works really well with like restraints, and it just makes the idea that there's like so many different ways to say things interesting, because then you have to like pick a way to say something and stick with it. And yeah, I think that that's just a really interesting concept. And my favorite novel, which inspired Animals Don't Go to Hell, is also a work that I've read in translation. It was originally written in German, and I've read 2 different translations of it. And I think that also kind of inspired me when working on the really short poems in my chapbook to like think about exactly like what the right word to use is.
So yeah, let's talk about that. Like I'm super like so curious about the way that the so spare poems in Animals Don't Go to Hell. Like I remember when I have it here, when I got the chapbook in the mail and I opened it up and saw like all that white space, and I was like, oh my God, I so admire like that ability to just be like, yep, this is just going to hang out here on the page and you can deal with it. You know, it's like almost a challenge to the reader in a sort of way to just be like, yeah, I'm not going to give you like a whole stack of words. Like you have to like hang out here in this empty space with me and like feel whatever feelings you're going to have.
Yeah, first of all, thank you for the support and for getting a copy of my chapbook. That means a lot, and I really appreciate it. I think to me, like the white space is just as important as like the words, because I want to give the reader time to like sit with this. I think as a reader, sometimes I'll move through things too quickly, especially if there's a lot written on the page, because the way that my brain works, I guess, is that like I want to finish something and I want to like, you know, be able to get to the stage of processing it and then like get through that. And I think the way that I write, I'm trying to kind of resist that like impulse for myself and also for readers. Like I want them to have to be like, oh, that's it. Like there's not more for me to read on this page. Well, I guess I just have to like think more about what's there. So kind of like reallocating the time from like the actual reading to like the stopping and like finishing reading and thinking about what just happened, I guess. So I hope that that's effective.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that, yeah, again, like if, you know, if I open this up and I'm seeing, you know, on page 19, literally, you know, 4 lines of, you know, about 3 words, 2 and 3 words each. And it's like that there's such a gauntlet. I mean, like, I don't know. Again, it's interesting to hear you say that you were sort of working against your own impulse to want to like read a lot of text and read really fast and move on to the next thing. Cause like, I'm totally the same way. Like my husband is a comic scholar and he always makes fun of me. Cause I always say like, when I read a graphic novel, I'm like, well, I'm just reading the text. I don't really look at the pictures. He was like, Allison, you're supposed to look at the pictures. And I'm like, I know, but it's just like, such a bad habit from like, yeah, being an editor and being a writer and being a reader. And so I feel like it's almost graphic in that sense to have so much white space around these very, very short poems. So yeah, just I would love to hear, well, if you have any of these that you would like to read, I would love for you to share some with the listeners.
Yeah, sure. I think there's like a series of a few of them that I can read. And also I want to read like the quote at the beginning just to make sure that I'm acknowledging like the book that inspired this. So I'll start with that.
Yeah, please.
He told me the story of Paolo and Francesca. For all eternity, said Franz, they are condemned to fly through hell, chased and pushed by violent gusts of wind. But they don't let go of each other. Despite the torments of hell, they never cease loving each other. Animals don't go to hell, said I. That's a quote from Monica Marin's Animal Triste, translated by Bridget Goldstein. I'll always be idler than you ever could, colder, but still ready to be stripped. Don't ever think I was in love with you. I only refused to hide from the splitting. If I were a better person, I'd answer when you spoke. If I were a better animal, you wouldn't see me coming. All fours, I want to always only be able to receive is a verb, is a virtue. What could I have given you that you hadn't already hunted for yourself? Only softer, blunter, heavy with milk and honey, no scratches, no bites. I was your easiest prey, but your boniest meal. So yeah, that I think provides, I guess, a good sense of what the overall collection is like.
Thank you so much for reading. I'm so glad that you read the one on page 5, If I Were a Better Person. That's like absolutely one of my favorites in this collection.
Thank you. Yeah, I think, again, like forcing restraints on myself, like having to structure both of the stanzas in the same way, and then figuring out which words to change to say what I'm trying to say is something that I will go back to, just because I feel like that's kind of how my brain works, I guess, through like repetition and circling back onto the same thoughts, and being able to locate how I feel within that.
So yeah, you spoke a little bit earlier about your sort of gestured towards, the amount of time that it takes you to produce a poem. And so what was the process like of working on these? I mean, you said that, starting this new day job really changed the way that you were writing. Like, what was that process like for you to like end up at this style, which really does seem a lot different than the earlier poems of yours that I've read?
Yeah, that is definitely true, just because the way that I was writing them totally changed. I think especially in university with my first chapbook, those poems I like maybe wrote for a class, and I workshopped them with friends after our classes at like a cafe, and like it was a much more I guess like academic experience, and more of like a I don't know, maybe the traditional way of working on poetry. And with post-university, like real working life writing, I do a lot of my writing from bed. I'm tired and I just like think of something and I'm like, if I don't write this down now, I'm gonna like forget it. And so I'll like pull up like Google Keep, which is where like I have all my notes, and we'll write down a line or two that was stuck in my head that morning, or I'll put something in a Google Doc really quickly, and again, like trying to like group similar thoughts together within like Google Docs, and going from there. And then if I like, I'll do that kind of like throughout the week, and I try on the weekends to be able to like, I don't know, get myself a nice coffee, sit in bed, pull up the notes I had been making throughout the week and try to like flesh those out a bit, play around with line breaks and moving things around on the page. And again, it's like playing with like the white space of the Google Doc basically, and seeing where to move these units to make a whole that feels like honest, but still feels like artistic, I guess, instead of just like something that I thought one day and wrote down. So that's where kind of like different like structures that I go back to come in. And I think this in like I guess like my lifestyle informs the new writing style that I have, because it's like taking pieces and turning them into a whole, and a lot of it is like I will write something down for a very short time. A lot of it is the editing and the moving it around on the page and like the structuring of it. And I think that's something that is definitely informed by my job as an editor, and also just like the constraints on my life.
No, I thank you for talking through that. And also I love that you write in bed, because I am also a write in bedder. I remember going to Edith Wharton's house a couple of years ago out east, and they took us, through her bedroom and talked about how she liked to like write in bed with her dogs. And I was like, I love, I always love the hearing, when people are just like, no, I'm going to lay in bed. It's the best place to be. But I was also, I like am not a poet. Like I was an English major, and like I didn't study a lot of poetry. Like I read, we read mostly novels in the classes that I took. And so like poetry is so mysterious to me that I was sort of laughing to myself. I was like, I almost could have done this podcast chat with you without, I mean, of course I wanted to read your pieces, and I have, enjoyed reading your pieces, but like there's this part of me that's so fascinated with like what poets do that like I almost like wouldn't have even needed to have read any of your pieces, because I'm just like, tell me the magic that goes into this, and so I love hearing you talk about like, it's just a Google Doc, and I'm working on editing. It's just like I love the demystification of that.
I think it's definitely become almost just like a scientific process for me too, because of my job and going through like more of like I don't know, I've shifted into like a journalism mindset because of my work, and especially with like medical writing. One thing that I learned when I started my job is that you're not supposed to say the patient suffered. Like you're not supposed to say they suffered with the XYZ conditions. You're supposed to say experienced or lived with, to avoid, I guess, like attributing a certain kind of like loaded emotion onto a person. And that's been like kind of like, that was like a game changer for my writing, because I don't want to like victimize myself or attribute something to me that is heavier than it needs to be. So I don't want to think of like an emotion that I go through, an experience that I go through, as something that like I suffered. So I like to, that's another like, I guess like exercise that I'll use to try to think of a more precise word, something that I relate to more. And having started like that job in like 2017, like that's kind of when I feel like my style changed a lot, and then like my writing process and the way that I thought about writing poetry changed a lot, and it became this more of like like scientific editorial thing versus like, I don't know, something like magic that it might have felt like previously.
No, that's super interesting, because one of the things that, especially in Animals Don't Go to Hell kind of leaps off the page is like, one of the first words that comes to mind is sort of vulnerability. Like these poems seem really vulnerable, both because of their brevity, sort of there's nowhere to hide on the page, if there's not lots of words and lots of stanzas. And then also some of the subject matter, that you're writing through feels really vulnerable and really raw. But I also, with poetry, I had to catch myself and be like, but is this Francesca's voice, or is this the poet, so to speak? And so, and especially again, in thinking about this sort of nexus that you're in between the journalism on one end and then sort of like the continuum with Sappho on the other end, it's like, where are you in these poems, if at all, and how do you negotiate that vulnerability, or that perceived sense of vulnerability?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that, I mean, one of the ways that I do negotiate that vulnerability is by using you in most of the poems, and kind of like, I don't know, being able to address it to someone else in this like lyric sense. I feel like that allows me to shift a lot of the weight off of myself and like use this other, like the subject of the poems is like actually the object of them. And so I feel like I get some distance through that. And that kind of like allows for more of a vulnerability. I think, yeah, who the I is in the poems is a really interesting question, because I don't think it's like me all the time. And like, I don't think that it's not me. I think it's more of like the I is like the emotion of that time and that space. It's not like something that has to exist before or after that. I don't think that like poems, or at least like my poems, like don't have to be like honest. Like I don't think that's like a requirement for poetry. I think they're more supposed to be this kind of like physical translation of a moment and an emotion. And I think what I'm trying to do is condense that and describe that in a really specific way if I can.
Wow, I love that. And it's so helpful too, because I think that, yeah, again, the time and the attention that poetry requires, it's helpful to hear a poet sort of speak through like, no, this is how I'm trying to lead you through this process, and in these various layers. I think that it can be easy to overlook, again, if you're reading it too fast, if you're just reading the words on the page instead of really sitting with them. So it's so interesting that, I tend to think of, as an editor, in my day job life, and in the ways that I edit my own material, like I always think of like editorial as being like the more clinical aspect of the writing process, whereas like sort of the inspiration for the ideas that go down on the page initially, like that I always sort of think of as the artistic part. But it sounds like in your practice it's almost the opposite. It's kind of like the initial impulse is like the prosaic sort of thing that you might have been thinking about, and then like the editorial process is the actual art and craft of it. Does that seem like a fair fair analysis or fair summation, or am I off balance there?
No, I think you're definitely right. I've always, like been a really like editorial person. Like I have been focused on like the details and like the minor corrections and like, I don't know, the structure of the thing more than the thing itself, maybe. Just because I feel like once I have that like initial thought out there that I've written down, like that's the catharsis for me. I don't feel like I need to try to like get more out of that than there was in the moment that I wrote it. And then after that, I'm just interested in what I can turn that into, just using what it is and not ascribing more to it than what it was, if that makes sense. And I love editing. Like that's why, like, I like my job, and I liked, like, I don't know, like it doesn't bother me that I'm not a writer, quote unquote, like professionally, and like I'm not like a really, poet-y poet, if that makes sense.
No, totally, yeah. So is that, I mean, does that go way back, or is that something that you discovered about yourself sort of in the process of learning to think of yourself as a poet, or was that something that was present sort of in the beginning for you?
I think
that sense of editorial, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's always been present in a way. Like I feel like when I was writing essays for school or something, like the getting the idea out there was like almost like the quickest and like not the most important part of it for me. Like I know that is the most important part for a lot of people, but for me, I was, more interested in like, the small changes that come after, because I feel like those are more important than a lot of people might think they are, or at least they are to me. And I feel like with my earlier writing, like in, I don't know, at university, that was more just like this kind of typical confessional writing, and I don't like regret writing that way. I think I was learning my voice, and again, like writing for more of like a university environment. But yeah, once I had, like interned at a publishing house and got a manuscript editing certification and started my editorial job, I think I was like, something kind of clicked and became more apparent to me that like that's what I like doing, and like that's what I want to be doing, like both professionally but also in my writing.
So you're not a procrastinator then, because it seems like procrastinators tend to just be like, it's all impulse, it's all words, and it's like you kind of can't do that if the editorial part is the part that you value. Then
yeah, no, I'm definitely not. I've always been a very like measured person, and like, I don't know, focused on my like routines and like deadlines and every boring thing like that. Like I love that shit.
No, go ahead. No, you're fine. Well, again, we joked before this went on, but that's the Virgo in you, right?
Yeah, definitely. I think, yeah, I've always been that way. Kind of like, I don't know, very much a thinker more than like a actor, I guess. And I'm not really driven by impulse, which I think works really well for a lot of people. And I don't think one way is like better or worse than another way, but I can't relate to that.
No, I love it because it's like I'm trying to be more like that. I'm my North Node is in Virgo, and so I'm trying to be on that path to learn how to be a little bit more methodical, because I was always a terrible last minute procrastinator when I was younger in school. And now I just, I don't have the stamina to procrastinate that way anymore. And also I'm realizing that, after, nearly 20 years as an editor, it's like, oh yeah, editorial really is where the magic happens. Like if you can get stuff down in the page and then work on it from there. That, there's a certain truth to sort of first idea, best idea, but then, to have the time to really sit with it and polish it. So like, I love the way that you said earlier, it's not just a thing that I said, it's not just a tweet or like a one-line thing on Instagram. It's like, then you're honing it, you're editing it. And that's a big part of the creative process.
Yeah, definitely. And I think like, I don't know, there's this kind of push in our society to like hustle and always be creating and like churning out like this like amazing content and always be on, but I definitely can't do that, and I really actively resist that. And I think that's part of why like I like taking things more slowly and like writing from bed and working on like one line at a time and focusing on editing. And I think there's something to be said for just a slower pace of life, and I try to translate that into my art as well.
No, I think that's so important. Yeah, because it is so easy to just get caught in that sort of, that trap of produce. Like I remember sort of early days of social media where it felt like, oh, this fun chance that you get to like put stuff out there. And now it's become into this like compulsory thing where it's like, oh, if you're not like putting stuff into the algorithm, like what are you doing? And it's like, ew, that's not why I started an Instagram account like however many years ago that was,
Yeah, I know. I feel like it's become such a, I don't know, toxic like minefield.
Yeah, it's like in Buddhism how they talk about the hungry ghosts. It just social media just feels like a very, very hungry ghost. Well, so you talked a little bit earlier about being a girl in this huge Greek American family, and then talking about the poetry of Sappho, and there is this sort of body attention in your writing, both as far as like the embodiment of being, in a woman's body, and then also, your love of using animal metaphors. I mean, again, the quote, comes from the novel, but animals don't go to hell as the whole title of your chapbook. I mean, so I would just love to hear you talk more about that and how those obsessions like keep coming up and around for you, and how they evolve, with your practice as a poet.
Yeah, definitely. I feel like I've always had this kind of like hyper awareness of my body existing in the world. And I think a lot of people who are socialized as women and identify as women have that as well. I think having to like see everything through, someone else's eyes, like I feel like as a girl, you don't look at yourself just as yourself a lot of the time. And that's interesting. It's a little bit of like a way that, or at least I feel like I like dehumanized myself in a way. And so I think the hyper attention to the body is maybe a way of trying to like reckon with that. And I think using like animals as a way to like explore that is a really interesting concept that came to me kind of through reading Animal Tree Stay, and definitely thinking about how like desire is like an animal urge. But I also had first started playing with that idea in 2017. I read a collection of poems by this German Jewish poet, Elsie Lasker-Schuler. And she has a line that has always stuck with me where she wrote, "I'm not a human being, I'm weather," which I thought was so interesting because I feel like my sense of self was very undefined and like fragmented at that point. And it made me think about how connection to the natural world can help us make sense of our own human condition. So yeah, after reading Animal Tree Stay and then thinking about like viewing myself through the lens of like the natural world, like whether that's, the weather or the animal, and like applying that to how I perceive human emotion. Particularly love and desire as ultimately something that is not even human, but animal. I think it allowed me to like locate and describe my own feelings in a more like precise and powerful way that made more sense to me.
So is that something like it's such an interesting sort of like looking glass place where it's like, does the poetry come through that portal, or do those concepts go through the poetry? It's sort of like, what's the vanishing point where they interlock with each other,
Yeah, definitely. I mean, everything kind of like goes back and forth like through that. Like, I feel like at this point, having sat with those ideas for, like a few years now, I feel like that has really affected how I think about everything. I feel like I don't ascribe maybe as much, I don't know, I think I'm able to view my body in like a more neutral way, thinking about it as like this, like animal thing. And now when I think about myself in that way, it trickles through that. It's less of like the initial thought being like this like thing that I then like translate through that lens, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah. Well, and in talking about, and again, you had mentioned before that this, part of your style change had been from being, in a community of people at university to now being sort of more solitary as far as, writing in bed and writing for yourself and writing around the edges of your workday. Like, where do you position yourself sort of in community of poets? Like, do you feel yourself as part of like a community of poets? Because like I know that there's this whole, we were just sort of joking about Instagram, but there was this sort of whole sort of Instagram poetry thing that kind of happened. Like, is that something you pay attention to at all, or is that something that just is kind of incidental to your experience of being a poet? Or
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting idea of like, what is the poetry community now? My first like experience of writing poetry, like in high school, was like I would just post things on Tumblr. For myself, there's like no sense of like gatekeeping, because you'll just like post on your blog and like no one's stopping you, and people can like it and read it, but it's not for them, it's just for yourself. And I think the initial community that I was involved in was other poets on Tumblr doing that, and kind of like the alt lit scene at the time in like 2013, 2014. And then when I went to university, like that was my community of poets, but now we're spread all over the world and we're not in the same like physical space. But I still think that like connections made through that have helped me still feel like I'm part of a kind of community. And also taking like poetry workshops has definitely helped me have that sense of community, even though I don't see these people face to face and we don't live in the same city. I've been taking this really amazing workshop that is led by the poet Ben Fama called Cool Memories. And it has an Instagram account where we can like share work and everything. But that's been a really important thing for me over the past year, just feeling like I have a space where, yeah, I can share work with people, and there are poets that I can talk about like technique with and get like feedback and exchange ideas. And that's something that I think not having that was part of the cause of like the rut and identity crisis that I was describing to you earlier. So
sure,
being able to return to that has been great. Yeah, so I would definitely recommend like workshops for people who feel like they need a community and don't have one for their art, because it is hard, especially now when you can't do things in person for the most part. Because yeah, I ultimately think like I'm a, you know, solitary artist, but also everyone needs community. Like humans are social animals. You're not going to get anywhere just like isolating yourself. And a lot of like the publishing opportunities that I've had to, I've heard about through people that I know and people that I might not live anywhere near them, but we still are able to have this kind of like, yeah, online poetry community.
Because that's also something that I was super curious about is this sort of whole publishing ecosphere, you know, of poetry. Because it's like, you know, I had never heard of, you know, Bottle Cap Press, you know, prior to you know, seeing the announcement about your book. And so, but then, you know, I was looking through their offerings, and they have all this amazing stuff. And yeah, it's like, so how is that really just word of mouth that you find out about, like, you know, who's publishing what, and talking to friends and saying like, oh yeah, you published with them, like you should pitch to them? Like, how does that work as far as getting your work placed, you know, out for publication, whether it's just online, you know, through an online thing or something that's printed matter?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is really just what I've heard about through friends on Twitter, on Instagram, on Tumblr at the begining. But yeah.
R.I.P. Tumblr, by the way. Like Tumblr was so great, right? Like
it was great. Oh my God. I was raised by Tumblr.
I love Tumblr. Like, yeah. And just like, as far as some of the writers that I would follow who would write like fanfic, like that was never anything that like I read on my own. But then like, as I saw people posting stuff, I was like, oh my God, this is so creative. And this writing is so good. Like, who are these people? So anyway.
No, I know. I feel like that's such an example of like why, I don't know, like the established poetry publishing world is like not inherently better than like Tumblr. Like I feel like there are so many talented people writing online just for the sake of writing and not getting any of like that like recognition from the establishment. And it's like I kind of carry that I don't know, that attitude with me still. Like I don't expect to be like published in Poetry Magazine, but that's not really important to me. I care more about like where my friends are being published. Like the reason I ended up sending work into Bottle Cap is because one of my best friends, Megan Boltz, her chapbook Rebel Blonde was published by Bottle Cap, and she's the most talented writer I know. So I was like, I don't know, they must like, I don't know, my writing must be like, let me rephrase that part of it. Like, I just feel like I knew that they would understand where I was coming from with my writing, because they had published someone who I was in the same community with. And they describe themselves as like a millennial publisher of poetry. And I think it's really cool that they're not shying away from that. And they've published so many amazing books, like, and they're just a small publisher. They don't have like, you know, like a huge budget. It's like a small team. And I think that makes the publishing experience more intimate and more valuable even than something that might come from like the establishment, I guess.
And do you see a divide between sort of digital publications and print publications, or is that sort of like a non-issue for you?
Yeah, I think I don't really feel like I need to see my work in print all the time. I don't think there's one mode that's inherently more or less valuable than the other, especially now. I think there's so much you can do with the digital space, and it's especially doing, you know, like virtual workshops and, you know, talking to my friends virtually the past couple of years. I don't see that there's like, anything inherently more valuable about seeing my name in print or online. I think what's important to me again is kind of like being able to have work that is accessible to people. And I think, you know, online is the ultimate like equalizer in a way.
Well, we're getting ready to wrap up here. And the one thing that we haven't talked about is like witching it up. We've talked about like our astro stuff a little bit, but like, you know, you were saying that some of your earliest work was in witchcraft, or what's the magazine called?
Witchcraft Mag. Yeah.
Witchcraft Mag. Yeah. So like, is that a thing for you? Like in your life, like, is that sort of witchery? Is that a tongue-in-cheek thing for you? Is it sort of, I just would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, it was definitely kind of like a formative, like lens for my writing, and something that I was very much like into when I was finding my voice in high school and at university. Like one of the first poet that I really read and loved was Anne Sexton, and she kind of has like this like witch vibe, like, you know, like, I don't know, playing with what it means to be like a good or an evil woman. And I think that concept is really interesting. And similarly, another huge early inspiration for me was Sandra Cisneros. Her collections like My Wicked, Wicked Ways and Loose Woman, like those were both huge influences and inspirations for me when I was, you know, figuring out what I wanted to say as a poet. And I think that whole concept of like the witch made me feel like I had permission to be bad, like I don't have to be good. And that's something that was very, very freeing for me, coming from, like a religious background, and being able to start to access this kind of like spirituality, and look, I don't know, beyond the good and the bad, and make, I don't know, my sense of like the world became like infinitely more complex after that. So I'm really grateful about that.
That's awesome. And I feel like that's an awesome place to start to wrap up, especially here in the early days of October, as we're in the witching season, heading towards Halloween, heading towards Samhain. I think that's perfect. So Francesca, thank you so much for talking poetry and life and love and spirituality and being embodied as in a woman's form, and here with me today. And so what's next for you? What's coming up next? You mentioned the the full-length collection you've got coming out, that's due to debut soon?
Yeah. So first of all, thank you for having me. I've loved this conversation. And yeah, so my full-length collection is set to come out sometime over the winter, early 2022. So I'll be focusing on that probably for the next few months. And I'm also starting to work on another collection too, just for myself right now, as of yet, like untitled, just writing down thoughts in bed. So I'll continue to do that. But yeah, and I'll continue to take workshops and work on, fostering a routine that can keep me. I don't care about being like super productive, but just I want to not stop thinking about my poetry. So I'll try to not do that.
And where can folks find you if they want to read more of your work?
I'm on Instagram at FMKRIT, and there's a link there to my link tree, which has links to all of my published work that's available online, and links to buy my book and my Goodreads and everything there. So would really love to hear from people on there.
And I will be sure to put that link in the show notes, because that was, I took a deep dive through the link tree in the past couple days, and it's amazing to be able to go back through everything. I love that you have it all compiled there for easy access.
Cool. Yeah. Thank you.
Well, and would you like to take us out with another bit of reading, if you have anything else to leave us with?
Sure. Yeah. So I'll just read a few more pieces from Animals Don't Go to Hell. All purifying forces are also destructive. Real beauty is feral. True love has teeth that only get sharper, and animals can't hate. When there's no way out, I just let you in deeper. Every good girl is just the same trapped creature. Did I see desire in your eyes, or only my own hunger staring back?